Beneath crowns and coronations, behind palace walls and painted portraits, lived royal men whose lives didn't match the myths. They led armies, signed treaties, married queens, and quietly loved in ways history refused to name. Some ruled empires, others ruled nothing but rumor. All of them left behind a trail of whispers, erased glances, and secrets stitched into royal robes. This isn't the history you learned in school. This is 25 royals who were secret-born female, a title the crown would never approve, for stories it could never quite silence. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed. This channel dives deep into the stories history tried to bury. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Paris, 3 a.m. in Jakarta. We want to know who's wandering through the shadows of history with us. 1. King James I of England. History prefers its kings to be decisive, virile, and violently indifferent. James I of England was none of those things. He stuttered when he spoke, limped when he walked, and sweated through his robes like a nervous priest. He was born under suspicious stars, the only child of Mary, Queen of Scots, and baptized into a throne-shaped cage where affection was currency and paranoia was custom. And yet, despite the monstrous expectations of kingship, James found his comfort not in conquest or matrimony, but in the velvet hush of male companionship. James fell in love repeatedly, visibly, and, perhaps most inconveniently, publicly. The most notorious of these affections was George Villiers, a man so dazzling that courtiers whispered he had the kind of face that could rewrite scripture. Villiers was younger, beautiful, and shamelessly ambitious, and James adored him. Not like a father, not like a mentor. James wrote him letters soaked in the ink of longing. "I desire only to live in your heart," he wrote, calling Villiers his wife and sweet child. One of those was weird enough in 17th century England. Both unnerving. They slept in adjoining rooms. They exchanged gifts so lavish they made Parliament uneasy. And James elevated Villiers to title after title until he became the Duke of Buckingham, the most powerful man in the kingdom, second only to the monarch. Some ministers tried to intervene, hinting that perhaps a king's affections should be less transparent. James ignored them. He once snapped at his council, "Christ had his John and I have my George." That went over just about as well as you'd expect. Of course, the official historians, the ones who liked their kings heterosexual and their records sanitized, called it friendship, a spiritual bond, brotherhood. But how many brothers write each other that they are ever yours to the death, in letters sealed with tears and perfumed like teenage valentines? How many close companions get pet names, custom-built palaces, and entire naval fleets rewrote to suit their travel needs? James's marriage to Anne of Denmark, while politically convenient, was emotionally muted. He fathered children out of duty, but never quite out of desire. The court gossiped, Europe speculated, and Parliament seethed. But James didn't care. He was the first monarch to rule both England and Scotland, a living union, stitched together with theology, tobacco, and theatrical politics. And yet, when James wrote poetry, it wasn't about empire or conquest. It was about longing for a face, for a touch, for a man. He wasn't the first royal to defy the script, but he was one of the few who refused to edit his performance. And perhaps that's the strangest thing about James. For all his intellectualism, and it was vast, for all his sermons on divine right and the sacred weight of the crown, he was utterly human in his need for affection. He didn't code his love, he didn't pretend. He made his preferences a feature, not a flaw. And he did so under the crushing expectations of a patriarchal monarchy that demanded heirs, warriors, and performance-grade masculinity. Even now, historians dodge the obvious. They call him eccentric, flamboyant, emotionally dependent. They catalogue his infatuations with euphemisms that clink like silverware at a funeral. But James left too many love letters behind. Too many rooms were built for two. George Villiers outlived James by only a few years. He was assassinated, stabbed by a disgruntled veteran in 1628. Some say he died believing he was untouchable. Others say he died with the last great secret of the English court still lodged behind his teeth. But if James was a king who loved like a man, Edward II was a king who loved like a scandal. And in his case, the crown didn't just tolerate it, it tried to destroy him. 2. King Edward II of England. Edward II didn't just break the mould, he poured wax into it, snapped it in half, and dared the nobility to stop him. It's almost poetic, really. Born into a lineage of conquerors and iron-willed Plantagenets, Edward was expected to rule like his father. Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, the hard-edged crusader, the man who could crush a rebellion between breakfast and prayer. But Edward II was not made of iron. He was made of silk, sentiment, and, unfortunately for him, scandal. At the centre of it all stood Piers Gaveston, a name that still rings through English history like a whispered accusation. Gaveston was everything the court hated: foreign, fashionable, and fatally close to the king. He wasn't just a companion, he was the son Edward orbited. The relationship began when they were young, when Edward was still a prince and Gaveston was just a charming Gascon knight with dangerous cheekbones and a talent for staying alive. Once Edward became king, Gaveston became something else entirely: a power broker, a fashion icon, a symbol of royal decadence, and most controversially, the king's favourite. Edward lavished titles on him like confetti: Earl of Cornwall, Lord of vast estates, Commander of armies. Nobles who had spent lifetimes clawing toward influence suddenly found themselves upstaged by a man they considered frivolous, effeminate, and too well dressed for his own good. But it wasn't just the gifts that unsettled the court, it was the intimacy. Chroniclers described their bond as beyond reason. Edward called Gaveston his brother, his other self, and the only one who truly understands me. Records show that they shared chambers, whispered through council meetings, and flouted every social cue about what royal masculinity should look like. The nobles weren't amused, Parliament fumed, and Edward, in true romantic defiance, simply made Gaveston more powerful. The barons tried exile, twice, but Edward always brought him back, like a moth returning to a flame that couldn't stop burning. Eventually, the political cost became too steep. Gaveston was kidnapped and executed by rebellious nobles, a public spectacle masked as justice. Edward was devastated. He wept openly, withdrew from court, and swore revenge. But this wasn't a Shakespearean tragedy played for drama. It was real, and the crown was beginning to fracture. Without Gaveston, Edward tried to fill the void. He took up other favourites, Hugh Despenser the Younger most notably, and repeated the same pattern: intimate bonds, swift promotions, public outrage. Despenser was more ruthless, more political, and even more hated than Gaveston. The nobility saw the same script playing out again, only this time darker, more dangerous. And all the while, Edward's marriage to Isabella of France, daughter of the King of France, disintegrated like parchment in fire. She was clever, strategic, and increasingly humiliated by Edward's neglect. And when she eventually turned against him, she didn't just rebel, she brought an army, a French one. Edward II's downfall was swift. He was captured, forced to abdicate in favour of his son, and imprisoned. And though the exact details of his death remain clouded in mystery, the legend endures that it was as brutal as his reign was tender. That's what the record says anyway, though some historians now suggest he may have survived in secret exile, living out his final years quietly, far from the gaze of a kingdom that had rejected him. But maybe the real mystery isn't in how Edward died, it's in how he loved, recklessly, openly, and inconveniently. He was a king who chose affection over alliances, sentiment over strategy, and desire over decorum. He broke the rules not with political cunning, but with emotional honesty, and history punished him for it. In the end, Edward left behind more than a failed reign. He left a riddle, What happens when a man wears the crown but refuses to wear the armor? What does it mean when a king is remembered not for war or law, but for the man he couldn't let go? Ludwig of Bavaria might have had an answer. He didn't wield power the way Edward did. He built castles instead of kingdoms, opera halls instead of empires. But in the quiet, candlelit corners of Neuschwanstein, he too was dreaming of men he could never quite reach. If you're still here after that, you're exactly our kind of curious. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories history tried to redact in footnotes. And while we're pausing between royal disasters, tell us in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it in your kingdom right now? 3. King Ludwig II of Bavaria. Ludwig II of Bavaria was born into the wrong century. That much is obvious. He was a 19th century monarch with the soul of a medieval troubadour, a ruler who preferred swans to soldiers and opera to order. His royal duties bored him, his ministers frustrated him, but what truly consumed him, what truly defined the strange spiraling life of this Bavarian king was beauty. Beauty in art, in architecture, in nature, and quietly in the young men who fluttered through his world like living statues. Ludwig didn't hide from his preferences. He just reframed them, disguised them beneath thick layers of myth, marble, and music. While his contemporaries chased power, Ludwig chased Wagner. He called the composer his dearest friend and savior and funded his operas with reckless abandon. And when Ludwig wasn't building castles that looked like they'd been summoned from a fever dream, Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, he was writing letters, hundreds of them, to actors, to servants, to soldiers, to stable boys, always men, always intimate, always a little too tender for a king. One such letter, written to his trusted aide Richard Hornig, read like a confession in slow motion. I have longed for your voice and smile. This separation is more painful than I expected. Another was sent to Paul von Thurn und Taxis, a handsome young courtier who received declarations of love in the form of poetry and personal tokens. Ludwig wrote to him, "Only with you can I be myself." For a man who spent most of his reign hiding from politics, these letters were the only place he could speak plainly. And then there were the equerries, the young officers assigned to assist the king in his day-to-day life. Ludwig called them "my angels." One in particular, a man named Alphonse Weber, was described by the king as the angel of my life. Their correspondence suggests emotional dependence, romantic longing, and that particular form of heartbreak that can only come when love is forbidden and completely unequal in power. But Ludwig's fascination wasn't just emotional, it was aesthetic. He surrounded himself with portraits of young men, commissioning paintings and photographs of them dressed as knights, saints, or mythical heroes. His private chambers were filled with romantic imagery, Greco-Roman statuary, and theatrical props. The line between fantasy and reality began to blur, or maybe it was never there in the first place. To his ministers, Ludwig was a nightmare, elusive, extravagant, and increasingly reclusive. He avoided council meetings, neglected governance, and spent more on castles and costumes than on roads or armies. He would disappear for weeks at a time, wandering the Alps, composing letters to his confidants, dreaming of operatic love stories where kings were noble and their companions adored them without fear. Eventually, the state intervened. In 1886, officials declared him insane without a formal medical examination and placed him under house arrest. Days later, he was found dead in Lake Starnberg under circumstances that remain unresolved. Officially, it was a drowning. Unofficially, it was a mystery. Ludwig was a strong swimmer. There were no witnesses. The only other person present, his psychiatrist, also died that night. And just like that, the Swan King of Bavaria vanished beneath the water, leaving behind a legacy carved in stone, written in candlelight and whispered between the lines of his letters. But maybe Ludwig had already died long before that night, the moment he realized that to be the king he truly was meant becoming a ghost in his own court. And if Ludwig was a ghost draped in velvet and moonlight, then Frederick the Great was something else entirely. A man who buried his heart with his lover and crowned himself with silence. The Prussian king who ruled with precision but loved with danger, and who never quite forgave the world for making him choose between the two. 4. King Frederick the Great of Prussia. Before he was the Great, he was just Fritz, a delicate, flute-playing boy with powdered curls and a defiant streak that refused to die. Born in 1712 to a father who thought poetry was poison and philosophy a French disease, Frederick grew up in a court where affection was rationed like gunpowder, and masculinity was a matter of marching, not feeling. His father, Frederick William I, was the original drill sergeant king, a man so obsessed with discipline that he built an army of giants just to admire them. Frederick, on the other hand, preferred reading Voltaire to shouting orders, composing sonatas instead of marching to drums. This was not an acceptable situation. Frederick's childhood reads like a case study in emotional suppression. His father beat him for reading, humiliated him for being soft, and once publicly slapped him for wearing silk gloves. At one point, the king forced his son to watch executions to toughen him up. Frederick responded by sneaking out of the palace to play music with commoners and plotting his own escape, not metaphorically, but literally. He attempted to flee Prussia at the age of 18 with his closest friend and possible lover, Hans Hermann von Katter. It was a bold move. It was also a disastrous one. The two were caught. Frederick was imprisoned. Von Katter was executed, forced to kneel before the gallows, while Frederick was made to watch from his cell window. According to legend, Frederick screamed and collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. He would never speak of Katter again, not publicly, not ever. But silence is its own kind of speech. After his father's death, Frederick ascended the throne and transformed Prussia into a modern military powerhouse. But the man who conquered Silesia and played war with frightening efficiency was also the same man who built Sanssouci, a summer palace named after the French for without a care. There he surrounded himself with artists, philosophers, and young male courtiers, many of whom were described in glowing poetic terms in his private writings. He famously invited Voltaire to live with him. Their letters were playful, biting, and emotionally charged. Voltaire once joked that he couldn't tell if Frederick was trying to woo him or just impress him with his Latin. But it wasn't Voltaire that lingered in Frederick's letters, it was his valet, Michael Gabriel Fredersdorf, a former soldier who rose to an intimate position in the king's private life. Fredersdorf was given extraordinary access, property, and privileges. Some contemporaries whispered, some biographers avoided the subject altogether, but the intimacy between them was a known quantity in the Prussian court. Frederick never married. He avoided court ceremonies that required him to play the part of a heterosexual monarch. He lived alone, with his dogs and books, and ordered that he be buried beside them, and not in the royal crypt with his family. When he died in 1786, he left behind a kingdom twice the size it had been when he inherited it. But he also left behind an archive of letters that hint at a man constantly at odds with the role he was born to play. In one of his most personal reflections, Frederick wrote, "I was born to a station that condemned me to act a part that I did not choose." The part he was supposed to play was conqueror. The role he seemed to want was companion. His reign was defined by victories, but his private life was stitched together with quiet acts of rebellion. Handwritten notes, secret gardens, and carefully worded affections never meant for the public eye. It's tempting to paint Frederick as tragic, but that would miss the point. He was not a victim. He was an orchestrator of statecraft, of deception, of carefully curated distance. He built a kingdom and buried his desires beneath its marble floors. And in doing so, he joined the long lineage of monarchs whose crowns doubled as closets. And yet, If Frederick's love was hidden in sonatas and state secrets, Alexander the Great's was carved into history with swords, statues, and grief so loud it shook the ancient world. A bond with another man so profound that entire cities were named in its memory. 5. King Alexander the Great. By most accounts, Alexander of Macedon never lost a battle, not against men, not against empires, and certainly not against geography. At the age of 20, he inherited a kingdom. By 32, he had an empire that stretched from Greece to India. It should have been enough, but Alexander was not a man who believed in enough. His appetite for conquest was matched only by his obsession with legacy, and at the strange, glowing center of that legacy stood Hephaestion. They grew up together, Alexander, the crown prince, and Hephaestion, the noble companion. They trained under Aristotle, rode side by side into war, and studied Homer like it was scripture. The Iliad became their blueprint, and Achilles and Patroclus their mythological mirror. Alexander saw himself as the reincarnation of Achilles, which made Hephaestion unmistakably his Patroclus. It was not a subtle comparison, and Alexander, famously, was not a subtle man. Hephaestion was more than a general. He was the one person Alexander trusted in a world where trust was as dangerous as open wounds. In a court riddled with opportunists and ambition, Hephaestion stood beside him, not behind him. He was given command of elite cavalry, diplomatic missions, and even personal letters to distant kings. Hephaestion didn't just serve Alexander, he completed him. Their relationship, chronicled in fragments across Greek and Roman sources, was intense, public, and emotionally charged. They dressed alike. They dined alone together. When Hephaestion fell ill and died suddenly in 324 BC, Alexander lost whatever remained of his composure. Ancient accounts describe his grief as wild, inconsolable, theatrical, but it wasn't just grief, it was devastation. He fasted, he shaved his head, he reportedly refused food for days. He ordered a massive funeral pyre to be built, 50 stories tall, gilded in gold and studded with statues. He banned music across the empire and demanded a national mourning period. Then he declared Hephaestion a god, not a metaphor, not a poetic flourish, a literal, state-sanctioned deification. A city was founded in Hephaestion's honor. Antigonaea renamed Hephaestionopolis, and oracles were instructed to include his name in prayers. It wasn't just tribute, it was obsession, ossified in marble and fire. Alexander didn't simply mourn, he canonized. Historians have debated this bond for centuries, often with the anxious vocabulary of people who suspect too much. Some describe it as a deep friendship, others hint at spiritual intimacy, but the ancient sources are less coy. The philosopher Diogenes Laertius stated bluntly that Alexander loved Hephaestion most of all. Plutarch compared their relationship directly to Achilles and Patroclus, a pairing that in Homeric tradition was soaked in tragedy, loyalty, and unspoken love. Still, the ambiguity serves a purpose. Alexander was a man of contradictions, a ruthless general who quoted poetry before battle, a king who conquered Persia but adopted its customs, a ruler who never named an heir because no one could replace what he lost in Hephaestion. In many ways, his empire was built as a monument not to his ambition, but to his grief. Because after Hephaestion's death, Alexander was never the same. He continued campaigning, but erratically. He drank more, slept less, raged unpredictably. Some said he lost his divine spark. Others said he was trying to chase death so he could find Hephaestion again. Less than a year later, Alexander died in Babylon, surrounded by generals, but completely alone. He was 32. There was no great final battle, no assassin's blade, no glorious end. Just a sudden illness, a fading voice, and the weight of an empire with no center. In his final days, Alexander was asked who should inherit his throne. He reportedly whispered, "To the strongest." But many wondered if he was simply buying time, because the only person he had ever trusted to rule beside him was already gone. Perhaps that's why Alexander's story still echoes through history, not just as a tale of conquest, but as a love story written in ruins, smoke, and half-buried names. He conquered the known world, but never recovered from the loss of one man. And yet, if Alexander ruled with passion disguised as power, Prince George of Kent played a more delicate game, navigating salons and scandal, glittering through 20th century Britain like a royal who was never quite what he seemed. 6. Prince George, Duke of Kent. In the gallery of British royals, Prince George, Duke of Kent, stands like a figure out of a hazy Art Deco dream, polished, enigmatic, and trailing whispers wherever he went. The younger brother of King Edward VIII and King George VI, and uncle to Queen Elizabeth II, George moved through the stiff corridors of Buckingham Palace like a man rehearsing a different play entirely. He was titled, tailored, and charming. He was also, as many contemporaries quietly noted, not playing by the usual rules. Born in 1902, George was the fifth child of King George V and Queen Mary, a household known more for its repression than its warmth. While his siblings fit neatly into royal moulds, the heir, the spare, the dutiful sister, George slipped into something altogether more ambiguous. He had the looks of a matinee idol, the polish of a diplomat, and the social instincts of a jazz-age libertine. He was fluent in multiple languages, served in the Royal Navy and the Foreign Office, and drifted through a world that seemed just a little too glamorous for official records. There were the usual aristocratic marriages dangled before him, alliances with continental princesses, rumours of dalliances with noble women, but George never quite stuck. What did stick, however, were the persistent, knowing murmurs that followed him wherever he went, about the company he kept, the salons he frequented, the parties that ended just before dawn. In Paris, in Berlin, in London, the same names kept surfacing beside his: playwright Noel Coward, South American diplomat Jose Uribarú, British actor Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and others who drifted just outside the perimeter of royal decorum. Biographers, hedging with polite euphemisms, describe George as complicated. His tastes were sophisticated. His social circles were unconventional. But those who met him knew better, or at least suspected. George didn't simply break norms, he made them irrelevant. He was the royal who could charm a prime minister by day and leave a bohemian party at 3 a.m. wearing cologne and scandal. The whispers around his sexuality weren't just whispered. They were catalogued in private diaries, police files, and secretive memos now buried deep in the royal archives. Some accounts describe him as deeply attached to certain male friends. Others, more bluntly, allege discreet affairs that took place in high-end hotels, theatres, and artist studios. It was all so perfectly out of step with the image the crown preferred. A royal man was supposed to be straight, married, and boring. George was none of those things. Even his marriage to Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, a stately, well-matched union on paper, didn't silence the speculation. They had 3 children and presented the expected public facade, but behind palace walls, their emotional distance was noted. George, it seemed, kept parts of himself tucked away, not out of shame, but perhaps out of calculation. He knew the cost of being too honest in a family built on discretion and denial. Then came the war. In the early years of World War II, George re-enlisted in the Royal Air Force. It was a gesture of duty, or perhaps escape, but fate had one more twist. On August the 25th, 1942, George's plane crashed in the Scottish Highlands. He was just 39. Officially, it was an accident, a tragedy, a royal gone too soon. But unofficially, the rumours flared again about who was on board, why the flight path changed, what secrets might have died with him. The mystery remains. The crash site was restricted, the investigation cursory. Some claimed he was on a covert mission. Others whispered he was carrying letters, private ones. No answers, just more smoke curling upward from the fire of speculation. Prince George left behind no memoir, no confession, no direct proof of anything, just fragments, letters in careful script, photographs with hands a little too close, friendships a little too intense, and a reputation that refused to conform to royal expectations even in death. But if George was the royal ghost haunting 20th century England, Philippe of Orleans was the flamboyant flame in the mirrored halls of Versailles, a man who wore pearls with his epaulets and loved with all the extravagance France could offer. 7. Philippe I, Duke of Orleans, in the golden halls of Versailles, where the chandeliers dripped like frozen waterfalls and the politics were as delicate as the lace, one man glittered just a little more extravagantly than the rest. Philippe I, Duke of Orleans, younger brother of King Louis XIV, was a royal who refused to be anyone but himself, which was a problem, because in 17th century France, being yourself was a dangerous sport, especially if yourself involved makeup, silk gowns, and a very public affection for beautiful young men. Philippe, born in 1640 and nicknamed Monsieur, the traditional title for the king's younger brother, grew up in the polished shadow of his elder sibling. Louis XIV was the embodiment of absolutist monarchy, strong, divine, terrifyingly composed. Philippe, meanwhile, was soft-featured, extravagantly dressed and prone to drama. While Louis raised armies and ruled with orchestral precision, Philippe collected wigs, hosted masquerades, and flirted shamelessly with courtiers, especially the male ones. He was, by all accounts, stunning, and he knew it. From a young age, Philippe was dressed in girls' clothing by his mother, Anne of Austria, supposedly to discourage rivalry with Louis. But Philippe kept the taste. Even as an adult, he favoured women's styles, silk gowns, elaborate headdresses, rouge on the cheeks. He attended court balls in glittering ensembles that made Versailles look underdressed. This was not coded queerness. This was royal pageantry with a wink, a curtsy, and a glass of champagne raised to every scandalized noble in the room. The French court tolerated this, to a point, because Philippe had something they needed: legitimacy. He was a royal prince, a soldier when it suited him, and, most importantly, married. Twice. His first marriage to Princess Henrietta of England was a mess dressed as diplomacy. Theirs was a union full of mutual tolerance, political alliances, and mutual flirtations, just not with each other. Henrietta had her lovers, Philippe had his, and Versailles had a field day. When Henrietta died under mysterious circumstances, too soon, too suddenly, Philippe's lovers were among the first suspects. The truth was murkier, as it always is, but the damage was done. His second marriage, to Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatinate, affectionately known as Liselotte, was more functional. They were fond of each other, and she was brutally honest, even in her letters, where she described Philippe's relationships with young men as well-known and endless. Because, of course, the most notable of these relationships was with the Chevalier de Lorraine. The Chevalier was everything Versailles loved and feared: handsome, cunning, and completely unapologetic. He was Philippe's favourite, not just in the emotional sense, but in the literal, dangerous court politics sense. The Chevalier wielded real influence, despite having no royal blood. He used Philippe's affection like currency, drawing enemies and admiration in equal measure. Other courtiers called him the real Duchess. When Philippe's wife complained, the Chevalier was exiled, and Philippe spiraled. His heartbreak was so visible that even Louis XIV had to reconsider. The Chevalier was allowed back. Versailles returned to its usual rhythm of gossip, parties, and sideways glances. Philippe, for his part, never denied his preferences. He didn't need to. He danced through scandal like it was a minuet, twirling past expectation and into legend. And yet, for all his flamboyance, Philippe was no fool. He was a capable military commander, notably at the Battle of Cassel, where he led troops with precision and courage. It confused his critics. How could a man in pearls command an army? But that was the contradiction at the heart of Philippe's life. He defied the binary expectations of power and pleasure, masculinity and elegance. He was both and neither, a soldier and a socialite, a brother to the Sun King and a mirror to every secret Versailles dared not speak aloud. In the end, Philippe's legacy is less about politics and more about defiance. He carved space for himself in a world that didn't want him to exist as he was. He didn't pretend. He didn't apologize. He lived, instead, in full glittering color, a royal in heels who kissed who he wanted, wore what he pleased, and dared the world to look away. And while Versailles whispered behind its fans, Hadrian would take the same quiet longing and carve it in stone, immortalizing his beloved Antinous in temples, statues, and a grief so monumental it became part of the empire itself. 8. Hadrian, Roman Emperor. Hadrian didn't conquer the world, he fortified it. After decades of Rome expanding like a lung, devouring lands, cultures, and dynasties, Hadrian built walls, real ones, lined with stones and sentries, and a message: this is far enough. Unlike his predecessors, he wasn't obsessed with expansion. He was obsessed with beauty, structure, order, harmony. And somewhere between the lines of his policies and pillars, he revealed a private empire, one not marked on maps, but etched into statues, verses, and the haunted name of a single young man: Antinous. It's impossible to understand Hadrian without him. Their story is one of the most enduring, enigmatic, and, in some corners of history, deliberately misunderstood relationships in the Roman world. Antinous was a Bithynian youth from modern-day Turkey, handsome beyond reason, quiet, athletic. He met Hadrian in his teens and quickly became his companion. Not just a page, not a servant, not a footnote, a presence, an influence, a muse. The ancient sources, cautious and selective, refer to Antinous with all the vague poetry that historians often reserve for relationships they don't know how to categorize. They call him beloved, favored, dear to the emperor. But the evidence sprawled across the ruins of the Roman world tells a different story, or rather it screams the parts the text refuses to say. Hadrian didn't just mourn Antinous when he died, he immortalized him. The young man drowned in the Nile in 130 AD. The official explanation was accidental. The unofficial theories vary. Some claimed it was ritual sacrifice, others whispered suicide, but what followed was unmistakable. Hadrian broke, and then he began building. A new city was founded near the site of Antinous's death, Antinopolis, constructed in his name as a permanent marble-boned elegy. Across the empire, statues of Antinous appeared, hundreds of them, in temples, gardens, private homes. He was sculpted as a god, a hero, a constellation. The Romans had deified emperors before. They had never done this for a non-royal youth. It was personal, and it was public. Hadrian wanted the world to remember. And more strangely, he wanted them to love Antinous too. He established a cult in his honor. Coins were minted, bearing Antinous's face. Poets wrote hymns. Painters imagined him as Apollo, Dionysus, Osiris. The message was clear. This was not merely grief. This was a legacy by design. Hadrian, ever the architect, transformed memory into infrastructure. Back in Rome, the whispers began. The Senate was uncomfortable. The court was baffled. No emperor had ever shown such extravagant devotion to a companion of humble origin, much less one who wasn't, by Roman standards, politically useful. But Hadrian didn't explain. He didn't defend. He simply continued, commissioning sculptures, dedicating festivals, and surrounding himself with images of Antinous for the rest of his life. And here's the thing. Hadrian was not a sentimental man. He was calculating, intelligent, even cold in his reforms. He reorganized the military, centralized administration, and codified law. He rebuilt Jerusalem, controversially renamed it, and strengthened Roman infrastructure across Europe. But when it came to Antinous, all that pragmatism crumbled into myth. Modern historians have tried to reshape the narrative. Some call it political theater, others treat it as imperial eccentricity. But when you walk through the Vatican museums or the Louvre and see the uncanny softness of Antinous' marble face, repeated over and over again, always youthful, always distant, it's hard not to see it for what it was, the residue of a love too overwhelming to be buried. Hadrian would die 8 years after Antinous. By then, his reign had become synonymous with consolidation and culture, a rare pause in the Roman appetite for conquest. But underneath that political legacy lies another, an emperor who fell in love and refused to let history forget it. And if Hadrian preserved his grief in stone, William Rufus of England carved his secrets into silence. A flamboyant king with no heirs, a court full of beautiful men, and a mysterious end that still smells faintly of royal cover-up. 9. King William II. Rufus of England history doesn't remember William II of England as kindly as it might. Known as William Rufus, Rufus for his red hair, or perhaps for the red temper that often accompanied it, he has the misfortune of being the least understood of the Norman kings and the most suspiciously erased. He ruled from 1087 to 1100, taking over from his father William the Conqueror, and unlike his war-hardened dad or saintly younger brother Henry, William Rufus has always been filed under problematic, which is convenient, because his life, and particularly his death, raise more questions than the royal record would like to answer. William never married, he never produced an heir. He showed little interest in women, much to the exasperation of his court, and he ruled with a flair for extravagance and favoritism that sent churchmen into fits. Chroniclers of the time, mostly monks who preferred their kings austere and heterosexual, accused him of surrounding himself with effeminate young men and indulging in luxuries more befitting a Roman than a Christian monarch. His court, by most accounts, was glittering and strange. He favored fashionable clothing, extravagant feasts, and male courtiers whose presence seemed less political than personal. William's close relationships with a small circle of young men were noted, sometimes praised for their loyalty, more often criticized for their perceived indulgence. Rumors swirled about what went on behind the heavy curtains of the royal chambers. The king didn't comment. He didn't have to. He already had the crown. To the church, William was a walking provocation. He delayed the appointment of archbishops. He taxed clergy harshly, and he openly defied the moral expectations of the time. Chroniclers called his court a nest of sin, though what exactly they meant was left to the imagination. The medieval imagination, it turns out, could be very colourful. One monk accused him of horrid lusts, while another noted that no man's chastity was safe in his court. These are not subtle accusations, even by medieval standards, and while later historians often brush them off as exaggeration or monastic bias, it's worth asking, why these rumours? Why this king? Why such consistent discomfort around his personal life? The truth, of course, is shrouded, not just in time, but in politics. William Rufus was not a popular monarch. He fought with the church, levied heavy taxes, and played dangerous games with the barons. His refusal to marry made succession unclear, and his favoritism towards certain young male courtiers, including Ranulph Flambard, who rose shockingly fast in court ranks, created enemies who were patient. And then came the Forest. On August the 2nd, 1100, William was found dead in the New Forest, an arrow through his chest. The official version is that it was an accident, a stray shot during a hunting trip, fired by one Walter Tyrrell. But the details are odd. The king's body was discovered by peasants, not his own men. Tyrrell fled the country immediately. No investigation was ever conducted, and his younger brother Henry wasted no time seizing the crown. He was crowned just 3 days later. It was, even by medieval standards, suspicious. Some have suggested it was an assassination disguised as misfortune, a political murder dressed up in hunting gear. And if that's the case, what were they silencing? A king who upset the balance of power, or a man whose private life made his reign inconvenient? William Rufus left no heirs, no queen, and no legacy that fit the church's preferred model of rulership. He left only questions about the real nature of his court, the reason for his isolation, and the arrow that pierced both his chest and the royal narrative. But whatever secrets he took into the trees, one thing is clear: William ruled on his own terms. Unmarried, unfazed, and flamboyant in an era that demanded piety and patriarchy. He didn't conform. And in the end, perhaps that was the deadliest crime of all. And while William's life ended beneath the boughs of an English forest, Umberto II of Italy would watch his monarchy wither in full view, not with arrows, but with rumours, resignations, and the quiet, aching distance of a king who never quite came home. 10. King Umberto II of Italy. If monarchy is theatre, then King Umberto II of Italy was cast in a role he never got to perform. Crowned for just 34 days in 1946, a reign shorter than most modern leases, Umberto is remembered as the May King, a nickname that sounds charming until you realise it's really a eulogy. By the time he wore the crown, the monarchy was already dying. And perhaps so was something else, a carefully maintained royal fiction about masculinity, identity and affection, one that Umberto had been quietly rewriting long before he ever reached the throne. Born in 1904 to King Victor Emmanuel III and Queen Elena of Montenegro, Umberto grew up in a house of mirrors. His father was remote, conservative, and ruled during a time of deepening political instability. The House of Savoy, once a cornerstone of European royalty, was losing its grip on its image, on its people, and eventually on its future. In that context, Umberto's early life was curated for public consumption. He was groomed as a military man, paraded as a patriotic prince, and presented to the world as Italy's princely ideal, disciplined, dutiful, and unquestionably heterosexual. Privately, however, the portrait looked different. Even before his marriage, whispers followed him. In aristocratic circles and among diplomatic elites, there were stories. Discreet, elliptical, persistent. Rumours of close friendships with male officers during his military service. Late-night salons in Turin, affectionate letters never meant for public eyes. While his official biography emphasized his decorum and sense of duty, insiders noted something else: a cultivated emotional distance from women and an unmistakable ease around his male peers. His eventual marriage to Princess Marie-José of Belgium in 1930 was billed as a dynastic triumph. On paper, they were a perfect match, Catholic, photogenic, and well-connected. But behind palace doors, the relationship was brittle. The couple spent long periods apart, and their emotional estrangement became public knowledge. Marie-José once famously remarked that they were more siblings than spouses, a devastatingly revealing quote, especially in a monarchy desperate to produce not just heirs but illusions. They had 4 children, the necessary heirs, but the marriage remained performative, a diplomatic arrangement frozen in time. And while Marie-José immersed herself in anti-fascist causes and humanitarian work, increasingly in defiance of the regime, Umberto lingered in a strange royal limbo, too conservative for the part his wife was playing, too ambiguous for the role his country demanded. Then came Mussolini, the war, and the final unravelling. Italy's monarchy, already fragile, was dragged into collaboration with fascism, and Umberto's father, Victor Emmanuel III, made choices that would doom the dynasty. As the war ended and Italy stared into the scorched mirror of its own complicity, the monarchy became a symbol not of unity, but of betrayal. In 1944, under immense pressure, Victor Emmanuel handed over powers to Umberto, hoping the younger king might restore the crown's dignity. It was too late. When the Italian people voted in a 1946 referendum to abolish the monarchy, Umberto had been king for just over a month. He never abdicated, but he did leave, quietly, without ceremony. He went into exile in Portugal, where he would live for the rest of his life, a king without a kingdom, a husband in name only, and perhaps at last a man freed from the need to pretend. Exile suited him. Away from the cameras and constraints of royal image-making, Umberto lived with discretion, but no longer quite in hiding. Visitors to his villa noted the company he kept, elegant, cultured men who appeared more than casually connected to the former king. European socialites continued to whisper. Some were sympathetic, others, predictably, were not. But the royal silence never broke. Not once. No scandal, no denial. Just a long, slow fade into irrelevance and perhaps authenticity. When he died in 1983, he was buried not in Italy, but in Hautecombe Abbey in France, far from the palaces of his youth. The monarchy he once led was long gone, a relic stored in textbooks and tabloids. But the questions linger, not just about who he was, but what kind of king he might have been if history, politics and protocol had ever allowed him to be whole. And if Umberto wore his crown like a man walking off stage, then Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria clung to his royal script, only to realize too late that the role he was cast in was never meant for someone like him. 11. Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria. Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria was born with a sword at his side and a script in his cradle. The only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth, better known as the tragic, restless Sisi, Rudolph was never just a boy. He was a future emperor, a living promise, and a carefully polished symbol of imperial continuity in a house already cracking under the weight of its own pageantry. But behind the portraits and press releases was a deeply conflicted man, brilliant, melancholic, politically progressive, emotionally brittle, and suffocating under expectations that never quite fit. From the beginning, he was different. Sensitive, bookish, and inquisitive, Rudolph had little taste for the rigid militarism of his Habsburg upbringing. While his father valued order and obedience, Rudolph leaned towards science and social reform. He read Darwin, corresponded with liberal thinkers, and admired the modernization efforts happening elsewhere in Europe. In another family, perhaps another century, he might have been a reformer, a statesman, even a scholar, but this was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and being different was not part of the royal curriculum. His early education was harsh, overseen by tutors who attempted to correct his temperament. Where he showed affection, they demanded austerity. Where he questioned, they silenced. The lessons were clear. Emperors do not emote, they do not doubt. And they certainly do not seek companionship where companionship was not officially sanctioned. Still, Rudolph resisted, quietly at first, and then with increasing boldness. He surrounded himself with writers, artists, and intellectuals who existed far outside the carefully curated orbit of the Habsburg court. In private, he cultivated deep emotional connections with male confidants. Letters from this period hint at an interior life at odds with his public image, a longing not just for escape, but for intimacy on his own terms. One name that surfaces repeatedly in his personal correspondence is Count Joseph Hoyos, a trusted aide and one of the few people Rudolph seemed to rely on emotionally. The tone of his letters, affectionate, urgent, and deeply personal, left later historians wondering whether Rudolph's attachment to certain male companions crossed into romantic territory. In the often sanitizing world of imperial biography, such questions are typically filed under euphemisms like intense friendship or unusually close. And yet, they persist. Because what makes Rudolph's case so compelling isn't scandal, it's isolation. He was alone in a palace full of people, a prince expected to embody strength, yet given no room for softness. A man tasked with fathering the future of an empire while possibly searching for love in a direction history refused to face. His marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium was cold and functional, a diplomatic union, not an emotional one. Though they had a daughter, the two drifted apart quickly. Stephanie later described him as affectionate but tormented, attentive yet absent. Something mighty or someone so always seemed to pull at him from just out of reach. The strain was visible, his health declined. He began suffering from insomnia, migraines, and what doctors of the time vaguely termed nervous disorders. He drank more, traveled frequently, and according to some accounts, confided only in a small circle of trusted male attendants. In these men, he seemed to find a sense of ease that was conspicuously absent from his royal obligations. But peace, even in fragments, couldn't compete with pressure. By his late 20s, Rudolf was consumed by disillusionment. With the monarchy, with his father, possibly with himself. He no longer believed in the Habsburg project, yet had no power to reshape it. He was a reformer with no audience, a prince with no future he could live with. The end of his life, shrouded in mystery, speculation, and official silence, was in many ways a reflection of how he had lived, emotionally veiled, politically inconvenient, and permanently miscast. Official histories remember him for a single tragic event, but that legacy, cold and tidy, erases the complexity of a man who may have simply wanted to be known, understood, and loved beyond the limits of his dynasty. And if Rudolf was a prince unraveling in velvet halls, then Prince Eugene of Savoy was something rarer. A man who defied both sword and stereotype, building his legend not through scandal but through whispered elegance and a lifelong refusal to marry anything but art. 12. Prince Eugene of Savoy. In the pantheon of great generals, Prince Eugene of Savoy is a puzzling figure. He was a man who looked like a court poet but commanded armies like a war god. Born in 1663 in Paris, exiled for reasons equal parts scandal and suspicion, and eventually becoming one of the most brilliant military minds in Austrian history, Eugene was as paradoxical as the empire he served. He won battles by day and collected antiquities by night. He routed the Ottomans in the east and the French in the west, but he never married, left no heirs, and surrounded himself with a rotating cast of beautiful young aides who accompanied him from battlefield to ballroom. He was the kind of man who commissioned libraries and fortresses with equal passion, wore powdered wigs into war, and signed military treaties with the same hand that penned love poems in Italian. And like so many royals who lived too far outside the margins of acceptability, his life has been curated through selective memory, emphasized in marble busts but blurred in matters of the heart. Eugene was born into the French aristocracy, but the Sun King himself, Louis XIV, turned his back on him. The reasons were cloaked in polite language, an apparent lack of physical strength, an unsuitable temperament for priesthood, a scandal involving a female cousin's court, but beneath it all was something more elusive. Eugene didn't fit the role he was assigned. Whether it was his sharp intellect, his aversion to rigid court politics, or the rumors already trailing him like a scent, France politely declined his services. So he turned to Vienna, and Vienna said yes. There Eugene carved out a career that would redefine the Habsburg military. He became a field marshal, an imperial counselor, a strategist without peer. But unlike his contemporaries, he never draped himself in family crests or paraded a bride through court. In fact, he never married at all, and that, for a man of his rank, was almost unheard of. It wasn't just a curiosity, it was an open question. His private life was private in the most deliberate sense, but the gaps spoke louder than the records. His closest companions were always young men, aides-de-camp, secretaries, personal attendants. They travelled with him, dined with him, and sometimes received gifts and estates beyond what their positions suggested. The most prominent among them was Count Franz von Lothringen, who remained at Eugene's side for over 2 decades. The depth of their relationship is hinted at in letters and estate records, though never directly admitted, because nothing was ever directly admitted. Eugene lived in the Winter Palace in Vienna and the Belvedere, both of which he personally designed and filled with art, books, and mirrors. The spaces were opulent but strangely intimate, designed for beauty and privacy more than grand performance. Visitors to his palaces noted their theatrical elegance, their atmosphere of cultivated seclusion. Eugen didn't throw lavish balls. He curated salons, and those invited tended to be scholars, poets, and the occasional impossibly handsome young noble who caught his interest. The court, of course, noticed. The clergy predictably whispered, and yet nobody dared to confront him directly. Eugen was untouchable, too valuable to the empire, too intelligent to be outmaneuvered, and too discreet to give his critics anything solid. He was a bachelor prince with the demeanour of a monk and the living quarters of a sybarite. His tastes were refined, his affections veiled, and his absence of a wife was quietly chalked up to eccentricity. In letters that survived, we glimpse his personality, ironic, emotionally guarded, and sometimes almost wistful. He once wrote, "I have fought many battles, but the ones within are the most complex." Whether that was a confession or a metaphor, we can only speculate, but it speaks to a man who understood restraint not just in war, but in identity. When he died in 1736, the empire mourned a war hero, a statesman and a patron of the arts, but not a husband, not a father, and not a man who ever answered the quiet questions about whom exactly he loved. He was a royal paradox, a man who served an empire by conquering its enemies and evading its expectations. And if Eugen survived by silence, King Christian VII of Denmark would suffer by exposure, unraveling in public view, tethered to his physician, and caught in a bond that no one could explain, but everyone noticed. 13. King Christian VII of Denmark. King Christian VII of Denmark was a monarch in title, a patient in practice, and a mystery in legacy. Born in 1749 and crowned at the fragile age of 17, Christian ascended to the throne of a kingdom that already doubted him. His childhood was laced with discipline bordering on cruelty, his adolescence marked by sudden outbursts and prolonged silences, and his adult life, well, it played out like a political ghost story. Everyone spoke in his name, but no one quite believed he was there, and at the centre of this strange, unravelling royal existence stood another man, Johann Friedrich Struensee. To speak of Christian without Struensee is to tell half a tale and call it complete. Their connection, politically catalytic, emotionally tangled and historically veiled, remains one of Europe's most fascinating unsolved bonds. One man wore the crown, the other arguably wore the power. Christian's behaviour was erratic from a young age. Historians have since speculated he may have suffered from what modern psychology would call schizophrenia, or a severe anxiety disorder, though no single diagnosis has ever fully explained him. What is known is that he was emotionally volatile, socially withdrawn, and prone to compulsive behaviours that made court life increasingly difficult. He would play pranks on nobles, make sudden inappropriate remarks during official events, and retreat for long periods into private, often childlike rituals. Enter Johann Struensee, a German physician, Enlightenment thinker, and one of the few people Christian seemed to trust. Struensee entered Christian's life in 1768 as his personal doctor, but he quickly became much more than that. Within a year, Struensee was not only managing the king's health, but also ghost-governing the country. He drafted legislation, issued decrees, and sat in on council meetings. Christian, who had previously struggled to follow even basic protocol, now echoed Struensee's phrases, parroted his political ideals, and followed him like a compass follows north. The court noticed. How could they not? The bond between the king and his physician was too close, too fast, too inexplicable. It wasn't just political alignment. It was something more intimate, more magnetic. Christian was known to gaze at Struensee during court proceedings, defer to him in private, and request his constant presence during meals, travel, and even sleep. Rumours swirled. The Danish nobility, already scandalized by Struensee's sweeping reforms, many of which challenged noble privileges, found his proximity to the king not just suspicious, but offensive. Struensee's influence grew rapidly. He was granted unprecedented access and power, made a royal advisor, and eventually elevated to the position of de facto regent. But he did not play politics with subtlety. His reforms were bold, enlightenment-driven, and deeply unpopular among the conservative factions at court. He abolished censorship. He limited noble privilege. He attempted to secularize public institutions, and all the while he remained tied to Christian like a shadow, a man some believed controlled the king, and others believed simply understood him. Of course, none of this played out in a vacuum. Christian's marriage to Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, the sister of King George III, was distant, formal, and almost immediately doomed. She was young, intelligent, and politically isolated in Copenhagen. Left alone in a foreign court and married to a man she barely knew, Caroline turned to Struensee for guidance. And then, according to most historical accounts, something more. Their alleged affair, breathlessly chronicled and widely condemned, became the scandal of Europe. But lost in that narrative is a quieter question. What did Christian know? And more hauntingly, what did he feel? Some sources suggest Christian approved of the relationship, or at the very least tolerated it. Others imply he may have been emotionally dependent on Struensee in ways that eclipsed jealousy entirely. The triangular dynamic between Christian, Struensee, and Caroline remains one of the most psychologically rich and perplexing arrangements in royal history. In 1772, the tensions snapped. Struensee was arrested, charged with usurping royal authority, and executed in a chilling display of courtly vengeance. Caroline was exiled. Christian, who had barely spoken in public for months, was returned to symbolic kingship under a regency led by his stepmother and conservative nobles. He would live for decades more, technically king, but functionally sidelined. In his final years, Christian was seen wandering palace halls, sometimes speaking to portraits, sometimes not speaking at all. The physician was gone, the queen was gone, only the crown remained, heavy, ornamental, and completely irrelevant to the man beneath it. And if Christian VII floated through life like a feather caught in political winds, King Henry III of France would march through court wearing lace, ruffles, and eyeliner. A monarch who ruled with a fan in one hand and a dagger in the other, defying every rule of royal masculinity along the way. 14. King Henry III of France. To understand King Henry III of France is to understand contradiction wearing a crown. He was a king who knelt before crucifixes and danced in pearls, who fasted obsessively and flirted flamboyantly, who commanded armies and surrounded himself with a gaggle of exquisitely dressed young men known as les mignons. He reigned during one of the most turbulent and violent periods in French history, the wars of religion, and yet somehow managed to draw as much criticism for his wardrobe as for his political failures. His enemies accused him of being too Catholic, too lenient, too vain, too strange. But the whispers that really echoed through the gilded corridors of his legacy were more personal, too feminine, too theatrical, too close to his male favourites. Henry was born in 1551, the fourth son of King Henry II and Catherine de' Medici. By all logic, he should never have inherited the throne. But death has a way of rewriting dynastic math, and after the successive and premature deaths of his brothers, Henry ascended, first to the throne of Poland briefly, and then to that of France in 1574. From the beginning, his reign was marked by controversy, much of it focused not on policy, but on presentation. Whereas previous French kings had donned armor and adopted stern paternal airs, Henry ruled in velvet slippers and perfumed gloves. He was notoriously meticulous about his appearance, changing outfits multiple times a day, powdering his face, curling his hair, and lavishing attention on details of fashion that even courtiers found excessive. His daily rituals became a form of theatre. The court watched, the court judged, the court whispered, and then there were the mignons. The word translates loosely to the darlings, but in context it meant something far more layered. These were Henry's closest companions, beautiful young noblemen with expensive tastes, dramatic personalities, and razor-sharp cheekbones. They wore elaborate clothing, rivaled each other in courtly affection, and were fiercely loyal to the king. Henry bestowed on them titles, lands, and his unrelenting attention. Contemporaries were scandalized. These weren't just courtiers, they were extensions of the king himself. They fought duels over access to his presence, appeared beside him in state ceremonies, and were often rumored to share his most private hours. Satirists had a field day. Protestants called him a degenerate. Catholic hardliners found his eccentricity heretical. Foreign ambassadors sent back reports with barely disguised disdain. One Venetian ambassador dryly noted that His Majesty spends more time on his toilette than on matters of state. It's difficult to determine exactly what Henry's relationship with the Mignons entailed. Most historical records, filtered through the language of moral panic, stop just short of accusation. But the intimacy was undeniable. The Mignons weren't just social ornaments, they were his emotional nucleus. His letters to some contain deeply affectionate language, and his reaction to their deaths, often in duels or violent outbursts of court politics, was profound. When one of his favourites, Jean-Louis de Nogaret de la Valette, was gravely injured, Henry wept publicly and ordered daily updates on his condition. Yet Henry also understood the optics. At times he tried to dispel the rumours with performative masculinity, hunting trips, declarations of loyalty to the Catholic League, even a short-lived marriage to Louise of Lorraine. But these gestures did little to erase the image the public had already cemented, a king whose affections disrupted the natural order. What's extraordinary is how persistent the image was, despite the chaos of his reign. France was fracturing under religious violence. The Huguenots and Catholics waged open war in the streets. The monarchy's authority was crumbling, yet somehow much of the commentary about Henry fixated on lace collars, earrings, and his unmanly entourage. It's as if France could forgive bloodshed, but not beauty. In 1589, Henry III was assassinated by a religious fanatic. He was the last of the Valois kings, and his death marked the end of a dynasty that had ruled France for centuries. The Bourbon line would follow, ushering in a new era of monarchs, stiffer, sterner, and decidedly less powdered. But Henry's legacy lingered in the folds of his silk robes and the perfume of his rebellion. He reigned as a man who refused to choose between power and pleasure, discipline and desire. And while history may have tried to reduce him to caricature, his life defies easy categorization. Equal parts tragedy, theatre and quiet defiance. And if Henry III turned royal performance into a pageant of ambiguity, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia would master the art of silence, keeping his secret sealed beneath layers of imperial duty, religious conservatism, and a palace that echoed with things not said. 15. Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia. There are royals whose mysteries come from what they say too much. And then there is Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia, a man who said almost nothing at all. Not about the court, not about the empire, and certainly not about himself. He was a member of the Romanov dynasty, born into privilege and tragedy in equal measure, and his life played out like a symphony of silence, duty without affection, marriage without warmth, and friendships too intense for the world he lived in. He never ruled, but he haunted the corridors of power, and while his public persona was sculpted in granite, severe, pious, and cold, the private man remains a ghost, hidden behind veils of imperial protocol and social discretion. Born in 1857, Sergei was the fifth son of Emperor Alexander II, a monarch who tried to modernize Russia and was eventually assassinated for his efforts. The Romanovs were a family of contradictions, reformers who feared change, autocrats who dabbled in liberalism, rulers who rarely ruled themselves. Sergei, though, always stood apart. He was more rigid, more withdrawn, more devout. Even as a young man, his demeanor was described as unusually serious, aloof, introspective, almost ascetic. He found comfort in religion, routine, and the quiet control of formality. But even in such a controlled life, rumors found him. He never married in his youth, a rare delay for a Romanov of his rank. Instead, he immersed himself in ecclesiastical art, spiritual writings, and the company of other young aristocrats, often men of striking appearance and equally striking devotion. It was said that Sergei had little interest in female companionship, despite the many noble matches suggested to him. And when he did finally marry, at the relatively late age of 36, it raised more questions than it answered. His bride was Princess Elizabeth of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria and sister of the future Tsarina Alexandra. The match appeared ideal: noble blood, shared Orthodox faith after her conversion, and mutual refinement. But those close to the couple described their relationship as emotionally cool, a union of religious intensity rather than romantic connection. Elizabeth herself later confirmed this, writing that their marriage was blessed but chaste. She adored Sergei, but the affection seemed spiritual, almost platonic. There were no children. Instead, Sergei poured his emotional life into his male friendships. Chief among them was Pavel Alexandrovich, his younger brother, and several close aides and attendants who remained in his inner circle for years. These were not merely professional relationships. Sergei wrote letters filled with deep emotional dependency and arranged his household around their presence. He was generous, sometimes lavish, with gifts and favors. His preferences, whispered among the nobility, were not entirely secret, but they were never discussed aloud, not in imperial Russia. Sergei's public life was marked by increasing conservatism. As Governor-General of Moscow, he enforced harsh policies against revolutionaries and non-Orthodox communities. He was feared, even hated, for his inflexible rule. He banned public entertainment during religious holidays, exiled political dissidents, and developed a reputation for impenetrable moral righteousness. To his critics, he was a fanatic. To his allies, a man of principle. To both, he remained emotionally unreadable, a man with no confessions. But repression has its price, and Sergei's control began to crack under the weight of Russia's growing instability. The empire was fracturing: war, famine, unrest in the cities. Revolutionaries marked him as a symbol of royal oppression. On February the 17th, 1905, Sergei was assassinated in Moscow by a socialist revolutionary who threw a bomb into his carriage. The explosion shattered the iron-bound silence of his life, literally and symbolically. It was one of the first major assassinations of the 20th century, and it signaled the beginning of the end for the Romanovs. His wife Elizabeth never remarried. Instead, she entered a convent, gave away her wealth, and founded the Martha and Mary Convent in Moscow. When she was later arrested by the Bolsheviks and killed in 1918, it seemed a grim echo of Sergei's fate, as if their shared silence had followed them into the grave. But what Sergei never said out loud remains louder than what he did. He lived in a palace full of ritual, bound by a court that demanded appearances and punished deviation. His emotional center, if he had one, was not his wife. It was not his titles. It was somewhere else entirely, preserved in correspondence, in unspoken attachments, in the stories the Romanovs never wanted told. And while Sergei lived like a statue in a cathedral, Tsar Peter III of Russia was more fragile altogether. Mocked for his softness, dismissed by his wife, and quietly surrounded by men he trusted more than any general or empress. 16. Tsar Peter III of Russia. Tsar Peter III was a man out of place before he ever held the crown. A foreign-born emperor of Russia who spoke more German than Russian, preferred toy soldiers to war councils, and was deposed before he could even settle into the imperial throne. His reign lasted just 6 months. His legacy, arguably, even less. But beneath the surface of ridicule and revolt lies a more complicated figure, one whose personal life, intimate attachments, and enduring oddness have raised questions for centuries. Questions not just about how he ruled, but who he truly was beneath the powdered wig and Prussian uniform. Born in 1728 in Kiel, Germany, as Karl Peter Ulrich, he was a grandson of Peter the Great and the designated heir to the Russian Empire. The Russian court, never one to embrace outsiders easily, regarded him with thinly veiled contempt from the beginning. He was awkward, he was eccentric, he didn't fit the imperial image. While his predecessors had swaggered through court life with all the requisite masculinity of a Romanov monarch, Peter seemed like a curious, detached observer, more fascinated by military miniatures and musical instruments than diplomacy or dynastic ambition. And then there was his marriage. Catherine the Great, born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, was chosen as his bride, and history would later record her as one of the greatest rulers Russia ever produced, but theirs was no love story. Catherine found Peter childish, aloof, and perhaps most damningly in her eyes, uninterested. Theirs was a marriage of ceremony and protocol, not intimacy. In her memoirs, written years after his deposition and death, Catherine painted a portrait of a man emotionally distant and, in her words, completely indifferent to women. That line has echoed ever since. Peter's own behavior did little to counter that claim. Despite being married to one of the most intelligent and charismatic women in European history, he often chose the company of his male officers, specifically young guardsmen with whom he would spend hours in private. These weren't political meetings or formal councils. They were social, often playful, and sometimes conducted in a tone that raised eyebrows among the courtiers. He lavished attention on certain men in particular, promoting them rapidly, gifting them expensive items, and spending long stretches of time with them away from the empress and other royal obligations. Some of these relationships were dismissed by historians as signs of Peter's emotional immaturity. Others have suggested a deeper, more personal significance, one that doesn't fit neatly into the official history books of Tsarist Russia. He was known to admire Frederick the Great of Prussia obsessively, not just politically, but personally. He modeled his dress, speech, and even mannerisms on the Prussian king. Some courtiers noted with unease that Peter seemed to venerate Frederick beyond the bounds of normal diplomatic admiration. Whether this fixation was political hero worship or something more emotional, we can't say for sure, but it was one more detail in a pattern of behavior that diverged sharply from the imperial masculine norms of the Russian court. Peter's reign was brief and chaotic. His reforms, though progressive in some cases, ending the persecution of the Russian Orthodox Church, for instance, were deeply unpopular. He tried to shift Russia closer to Prussian ideals, alienating the nobility, clergy, and military. Meanwhile, Catherine, more adept at navigating the court's dangerous tides, built alliances quietly and waited. In July of 1762, just months after Peter took the throne, she struck. With the support of the military, Catherine deposed her husband in a nearly bloodless coup. He was imprisoned at Ropsha, and shortly thereafter he died under suspicious circumstances. The official cause was an accidental altercation, but rumors of assassination have never quite gone away. Catherine's government buried the matter quickly. There was no funeral, no inquiry, no royal reckoning. Just silence. But the questions remained. Was Peter simply too weak to rule, or was he undone by a court that couldn't accept his differences, political, emotional, and otherwise? Was he a man who loved unwisely, or a monarch who never stood a chance because of who and how he loved? Peter III remains one of the most ridiculed czars in Russian history, caricatured as inept, mocked for his eccentricities, and overshadowed by the brilliance of his wife. But maybe ridicule is just how power treats those it doesn't understand. And while Peter faded quietly into imperial footnote, Prince Paul of Greece would grow up beneath the soft shadow of rumour, navigating foreign naval academies, princely expectations, and the kind of friendships that whispered of something more behind the immaculate tailoring and diplomatic handshakes. 17. Prince Paul of Greece. Prince Paul of Greece was never supposed to be king, and yet, like so many royals born into the smoke and mirrors of 20th century monarchy, fate had other plans. He was born in 1901, the third son of King Constantine I and Queen Sophia, into a dynasty that was both deeply European and perpetually in crisis. Greece, at the time, was still trying to decide whether it wanted to be a monarchy at all. The country had cycled through kings, coups, and revolutions with the energy of a soap opera, and Paul spent much of his early life navigating the diplomatic wreckage of his own birthright. He was exiled, then returned, then exiled again. He trained in naval academies across Europe, studied in Germany, travelled extensively, and seemed to drift through his young adulthood like a man constantly searching for a version of himself that might be safe to inhabit. Royal life by then had become a costume party of survival, and Paul, ever the polished prince, played his role with careful grace. Polite, reserved, immaculately dressed, and always just slightly offstage. It's in these early years, before the crown, before the war, that the rumours began to gather. Paul's social circles were elegant and male-dominated. He formed intense friendships with fellow naval officers and foreign aristocrats, particularly during his long stays abroad. In London, in Paris, and most notably in Germany, he developed close relationships with other young men that didn't go unnoticed. Some diplomats remarked that he seemed unusually uninterested in the usual parade of eligible princesses. Others described him as aloof, soft-spoken, and deeply attached to his inner circle of male companions. One recurring name was Prince Friedrich of Hohenzollern, a fellow royal and naval officer with whom Paul reportedly shared not only military training, but prolonged periods of private travel and personal correspondence. While little survives in the way of documentation, the royal archives remain, unsurprisingly, selective. Several contemporary letters and private memoirs from the Greek and German courts hint at a bond that raised quiet eyebrows. The young prince seems quite taken with Friedrich, one courtier observed, and spends far more time in his company than protocol strictly requires. Paul remained unmarried well into his 30s, an unusually long delay for a European prince of his time, particularly one expected to produce heirs. His eventual engagement to Princess Frederica of Hanover in 1937 surprised some and relieved many. She was beautiful, politically well-positioned, and notably younger, 12 years his junior. The marriage was quickly arranged and solemnly celebrated, but insiders noted its curiously diplomatic tone. Frederica herself, years later, referred to their union in unusually formal terms, often praising Paul's sense of duty and intellect rather than passion or emotional warmth. Still, the couple fulfilled their obligations. They produced heirs, including the future King Constantine II, and played their parts through war, exile, and restoration. Paul became king in 1947 after the death of his brother George II and ruled through a decade marked by Cold War pressure, internal instability, and the growing irrelevance of monarchies across Europe. But even as king, Paul retained an air of personal mystery. He kept a tight inner circle of male advisors, many of whom had been with him since his naval days. His most trusted aide, a former naval officer named Nikolaos Manou, lived within the royal compound for over 2 decades and was noted in palace records for accompanying Paul on nearly every state trip, often to the exclusion of his official staff. Again, speculation never crossed into scandal, but the silence around these relationships was conspicuous. Paul's reign ended in 1964 with his death from cancer. His son, Constantine II, would inherit the throne and soon lose it amid political upheaval. The monarchy was abolished in 1973, but Paul, unlike many of his peers, was spared the ignominy of exile by death. He was buried in Tatoi Palace, among the other royals of a bygone age, his legacy preserved in the polite language of history books and the quieter margins of personal memory. Today, Paul is remembered as a transitional figure, a modern king in a fading institution, caught between diplomacy and tradition, service and self. But beneath that diplomatic mask was a man whose private attachments never quite matched the public expectations of his crown. And if Paul walked the tightrope of royal discretion, Richard the Lionheart charged headlong into myth, a warrior king whose battlefield valor still echoes through legend, but whose bedfellows left medieval chroniclers clutching their rosaries and historians writing between the lines. 18. King Richard the Lionheart of England. Richard the Lionheart. The name alone sounds like something hammered into a shield, all fire, fury, and medieval machismo. Crusader, warrior, king, son of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II, brother to the scheming John, commander of Christian armies in the Holy Land. Few monarchs have enjoyed such heroic branding, and yet, beneath the chainmail and war hymns lies a tangle of contradiction that doesn't fit the chiseled narrative. Because Richard wasn't just a lion in battle, he was a man with attachments that made his courtiers uneasy, his clergy suspicious, and his legacy complicated. Born in 1157, Richard Plantagenet was, by every royal standard, a prodigy of martial prowess. By the age of 16, he was commanding armies against his own father. He was crowned King of England in 1189, but spent less than a year total on English soil. He preferred conquest to court life, and his real stage was abroad, in castles, on campaign, and amid the shifting alliances of crusader politics. But while Richard's military exploits have been recounted endlessly, his personal life remains curiously thin in the official records. And it's that very thinness, the awkward silence surrounding his private relationships, that suggests something worth examining. Because when chroniclers of the time did write about Richard's emotional attachments, the pattern they described was strikingly out of step with the medieval ideal of royal masculinity. Take, for instance, his unusually intense relationship with Philip II of France, a fellow king, occasional ally, and for a time what some later writers would dare to call a companion of affection. The two shared a bed for a period during their alliance in the late 1180s, a detail recorded not only in French chronicles, but also by Roger of Hoveden, an English cleric and court historian. To modern ears, sharing a bed may seem ambiguous, but in medieval political language it was loaded. Royal men did not share sleeping quarters lightly, and certainly not in the presence of their courts. The chroniclers were not subtle. Some describe the two kings as being inseparable. Others hint at a bond that rivaled marriage, which, incidentally, neither king seemed particularly invested in at the time. Richard's own marriage to Berengaria of Navarre was delayed, diplomatically motivated, and largely symbolic. They had no children, and she never once set foot in England during his reign. When asked about the union, contemporaries often noted its political utility, but rarely its emotional content. Even more telling is that Richard, unlike many medieval kings, never fathered a known illegitimate child. This was not just rare, it was nearly unheard of. Kings were expected to scatter bastards across the countryside like confetti. Richard, by all accounts, didn't, and in a period where the virility of a monarch was a matter of national pride. This absence did not go unnoticed. Then there was his confession. In 1195, during a penitential act before the Archbishop of Canterbury, Richard made a public declaration of sin so profound that he prostrated himself in the cathedral. The nature of the sin was never explicitly recorded, but the reaction of the clergy, particularly the urgency with which absolution was granted, has long raised eyebrows. Some historians believe it was a general act of penance for violence during the Crusades. Others, however, suggest something more personal, a whispered understanding that Richard's private attachments had crossed into forbidden territory. Of course, history has tried to protect him. The Victorian era, obsessed with chivalry and uncomfortable truths, reimagined Richard as the perfect crusader king, a pure celibate soldier of Christ, too noble for earthly pleasures. His absence of children was reframed as discipline, his intense male friendships as camaraderie. The shared beds, practical, the confessions, misinterpreted. Better to see him as a marble statue than a man. But even statues cast shadows. Richard died in 1199 from a crossbow wound during a siege in Limousin, still campaigning far from home. On his deathbed, he pardoned his killer, a poetic gesture from a man whose life was defined by contradictions. He was buried at Fontevraud Abbey near his mother Eleanor, whose political acumen had arguably shaped his entire reign. But his heart, quite literally, was buried in Rouen, in Normandy. A fittingly fragmented end for a king whose life was always torn between the battlefield and something softer, something quieter, that the chroniclers never quite dared to name. And while Richard's legend was forged in fire, Emperor I of Han left behind something far more fragile, a silk sleeve, a sleeping boy, and a legacy so tender that one small act of affection gave birth to an idiom still whispered in China centuries later. 19. Emperor I of Han. In the sweeping dynastic tapestries of ancient China, most emperors are remembered for wars, reforms, conquests, or calamities. But Emperor I of Han is remembered for a gesture, one small intimate act performed not with a sword or a scepter, but with a sleeve. He was not the most powerful emperor. He wasn't the longest reigning. He didn't leave behind an imperial legacy of awe. And yet, centuries after his death, his name still lingers, quietly, delicately, in the Chinese idiom duangxiu, or the passion of the cut sleeve. Emperor Ai, born Liu Xin in 27 BC, came to the throne at a time when the Han dynasty was already leaning on crumbling pillars. He was young, just in his early 20s, and inherited a court in political disarray. The empire had grown bloated with intrigue. Eunuchs, relatives, warlords, and ministers all wrestled behind the scenes, while emperors were made and unmade like actors in an elaborate, high-stakes drama. And into this script stepped a man whose reign would be defined not by military brilliance or statecraft, but by love, or at least something remarkably close to it. Dong Xian was a minor court official when he first caught the emperor's attention. Young, handsome, and elegant in speech and manner, Dong rose rapidly, astronomically in fact, through the imperial ranks. He was made a commander, given titles normally reserved for seasoned generals, and granted authority far beyond his years or background. Court records show that he was promoted no fewer than 30 times in a few short years. The bureaucracy grumbled, ministers protested, but Emperor Ai was unmoved. What was it about Dong Xian that earned such favor? The answer may lie in the infamous anecdote that spawned a legend. As the story goes, one afternoon, Emperor Ai and Dong Xian were resting in the imperial quarters. Dong, having fallen asleep on the emperor's silk sleeve, was still slumbering peacefully when Emperor Ai was summoned for urgent state business. Rather than disturb his companion, Ai took a dagger and cut off the sleeve of his robe, quietly slipping away so Dong could continue his rest undisturbed. This moment, mundane, human, tender, would echo through Chinese culture for centuries. The phrase duangxiu, or cut sleeve, became shorthand for same-gender love between men, particularly between rulers and their companions. Unlike in many Western traditions where queerness was hidden behind euphemism or sanitized through silence, this gesture was recorded, remembered, and immortalized in language. Not condemned, not erased, simply noted. Of course, that didn't mean there were no consequences. The relationship between Emperor Ai and Dong Xian became one of the most discussed, and for many officials, most troubling, aspects of Ai's reign. The emperor granted Dong a residence within the imperial palace itself. They were seen together constantly, in public and in private. Their bond wasn't merely emotional, it had political consequences. Dong's influence began to eclipse that of seasoned ministers, and his rapid accumulation of titles created factions and resentments within the court. There were accusations, whispered and eventually spoken aloud, that Dong Xian was ruling in all but name, that state affairs were neglected, that the emperor had allowed his personal attachments to cloud his imperial responsibilities. I, however, seemed largely indifferent to the criticism. His priorities were personal. In a world ruled by decorum and dynastic duty, he had made space, however briefly, for affection. But dynastic patience is always thin. In 1 BC, Emperor Ai died suddenly at the age of just 26, without an heir, without political allies, and without a safety net for Dongxian. The moment Ai's breath left his body, the court moved swiftly. Dong was stripped of his titles, exiled, and, depending on the version of the story, either forced to take his own life or allowed to fade into obscurity. The man who once shared a bed with the emperor became politically radioactive, and yet the idiom lived on. Unlike other royal romances, where scandal often buries sentiment, the story of Emperor Ai and Dongxian survived as a cultural metaphor. It appears in plays, poetry, and literature across dynasties. It became a symbol, not of shame, but of devotion. A simple cut of silk transformed into something eternal. And if Emperor Ai immortalized his affection in idiom, King Ferdinand III of Bulgaria would wear his secrets in brocade. A monarch who cloaked himself in art, flowers, and quiet flamboyance, ruling with a painter's eye and a court that whispered more than it spoke. 20. King Ferdinand I of Bulgaria history has a habit of flattening kings. It turns them into coins, into statues, into stern faces in schoolbook margins. But King Ferdinand I of Bulgaria resists that treatment. He was too strange, too theatrical, too peacocked. Born into the illustrious house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the same German dynasty that gave Britain its Queen Victoria and Belgium its Leopold IV, Ferdinand entered the world of royalty already weighted with expectation. But he brought something else with him, something the stiff courts of Europe never quite knew what to do with. An instinct for beauty, a fondness for opulence, and a private life stitched delicately with rumour, silk, and eccentricity. Ferdinand wasn't supposed to become a monarch. His early years were spent in relative obscurity, floating between the drawing rooms and conservatories of the Austro-Hungarian elite. But in 1887, after a series of dynastic crises in Bulgaria left the throne embarrassingly vacant, European powers agreed on a compromise candidate, someone noble, young, and politically pliable. Enter Ferdinand. He was installed as prince and later crowned as Tsar in 1908, the first of his kind in Bulgaria, a country trying desperately to appear more European while still haunted by Ottoman ghosts. From the start, Ferdinand stood out like an oil painting in a hardware store. He was a botanist, a lepidopterist, an art collector, and a fashion obsessive. He spoke 6 languages and had a habit of correcting others when they spoke only 5. At state dinners, he was known to critique the floral arrangements mid-toast. He imported foreign architects to design palaces in wildly eclectic styles, outfitted himself in custom-made military uniforms with unnecessarily elaborate embroidery, and made sure everyone understood that he was the aesthetic center of his court. Behind the curtains, the talk was relentless. Ferdinand never remarried after the breakdown of his strategically arranged union with Princess Marie-Louise of Bourbon-Parma. The marriage had produced heirs, including the future Tsar Boris III, but had clearly been more diplomatic transaction than emotional bond. Marie-Louise died young, and Ferdinand showed no interest in replacing her, not with women at least. Instead, his personal life became a constellation of cultivated young men, foreign courtiers, personal valets, and travelling companions. He had a particular fondness for the company of handsome officers, many of whom were promoted to curious positions within the court, far beyond what their military records might have suggested. In Parisian salons and Viennese drawing rooms, whispers floated like perfume that the Bulgarian king was too fond of male company, that he had eyes more for aesthetics than for affairs of state, and that he was creating his own private court of gilded loyalty and glittering discretion. It was widely rumoured that during his trips abroad, often officially diplomatic but curiously lengthy, Ferdinand lived far more freely than his conservative court in Sofia could allow. But this was not a man who begged approval. Ferdinand ruled Bulgaria with a sense of cold-blooded calculation that belied his theatrical exterior. He maneuvered the country through wars, crises, and political labyrinths with a ruthlessness that shocked many of his European contemporaries. He played the great powers off each other, navigated the Balkan Wars, and declared Bulgaria a kingdom under his own authority. A peacock, yes, but one who understood the sharpness of his beak. Still, the tension between his public sovereignty and private world never disappeared. During World War I, Ferdinand's alliances and ambitions eventually led Bulgaria into disaster. After the defeat of the Central Powers, he was forced to abdicate in 1918 in favor of his son Boris. And here the story takes an oddly poetic turn. Ferdinand did not resist. He simply left. Not in shame, not in exile, but in quiet retreat to his residence in Coburg, Germany, where he surrounded himself with books, birds, flowers, and the company he had always kept. He lived there for nearly 3 decades, increasingly removed from politics, increasingly flamboyant in his tastes, and still, always, flanked by young men who assisted him with the day-to-day rituals of life, from garden design to wardrobe selection. The monarch, who once wore uniforms like costumes, now dressed entirely for himself. When he died in 1948, Europe had changed beyond recognition. Monarchies had crumbled, empires had vanished, but Ferdinand remained in memory as something uniquely unclassifiable, a king with the soul of a dandy, the eye of an artist, and a life built not for conquest, but for curated control. And if Ferdinand crafted his world in colour and control, Archduke Ludwig Victor of Austria painted his reputation in flourishes too vivid to ignore, a royal who traded battlefield medals for theatre curtains, and whose downfall came not on the battlefield, but in the bathhouse. 21. Archduke Ludwig Victor of Austria. In the theatre of Habsburg royalty, where formality reigned and dynastic obligation drowned out personality, Archduke Ludwig Victor of Austria was the rare character who insisted on improvising his lines. Born in 1842, the youngest brother of Emperor Franz Joseph I, Ludwig Victor was given every advantage an imperial upbringing could offer: wealth, rank, opulent residences, and a front-row seat to the slow decline of one of Europe's most powerful families. But instead of military campaigns or political maneuvering, Ludwig Victor became famous, or infamous, for something altogether different: a flamboyant disregard for the rigid expectations of imperial masculinity and a personal life draped in silks, scandal, and spectacle. They called him Luzi-Woozy, a nickname that began as affectionate teasing and gradually calcified into court gossip shorthand. It captured his essence perfectly: light, effeminate, unorthodox, and somehow immune to the rules that bound his brothers. While Franz Joseph ruled with clenched restraint and Maximilian dreamed imperial dreams that led him to a firing squad in Mexico, Ludwig Victor was attending masked balls, commissioning portraits of himself in elaborate costume, and building a private life that didn't need to ask for permission. He had no interest in warfare, despite the family's military traditions. He was technically a general, as was the fashion for Habsburg males, but he never commanded troops or sought battlefield glory. Instead, he immersed himself in the arts: theatre, opera, painting. His residences were lavishly decorated with statues and tapestries. He adored classical sculpture, especially the Greek and Roman ideals of male beauty, and filled his homes with marble recreations of youthful male figures from antiquity. It was not subtle. The court tolerated it, mostly because Ludwig Victor wasn't politically powerful. He posed no threat to the imperial agenda. His role was ceremonial, his duties limited, his influence minimal. This allowed him a certain freedom, not absolute, but enough to live a life that hovered just at the edge of open defiance. He remained unmarried, claiming celibacy with the ironic overtones of a man who had no intention of ever producing heirs. His relationships were conducted with a mix of discretion and spectacle, always unofficial, never directly acknowledged, but visible enough that even the most cautious observers understood what was not being said. The most infamous incident came in 1906, not in a palace or political forum, but in a bathhouse. According to widely circulated accounts, Ludwig Victor was involved in an altercation at a Viennese men's spa. The details were quickly and heavily redacted in public reports, but the implication was clear. A scandal had occurred, and the Archduke had become its unwilling centre. Whether it was a misunderstanding or an exposed truth didn't matter. The damage was done. The Habsburg court, ever concerned with appearances, finally lost patience. Franz Joseph, by then an old and deeply conservative emperor, ordered his brother into permanent exile. Ludwig Victor was sent to Schloss Klesheim, a palace near Salzburg, where he would live out the remainder of his life in relative seclusion. But even in exile, he surrounded himself with beauty, both architectural and human. His personal staff remained loyal, his days filled with art and ritual, his solitude broken only by carefully curated companionship. Despite his fall from grace, Ludwig Victor never publicly recanted or adjusted himself to the image the empire had demanded. He didn't issue statements. He didn't stage a comeback. He simply continued, quietly, privately, and unapologetically. He died in 1919 at the age of 76, just after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The world he was born into, one of rigid hierarchies, enforced marriages, and imperial performance, had finally disappeared. In its place was a modern Europe, reshaping itself in the aftermath of war and revolution. Ludwig Victor didn't live to see much of that world, but in many ways he'd anticipated it. His life, eccentric and controversial though it was, had quietly chipped away at the idea that royalty meant uniformity. He was, in his own strange and often scandalous way, a trailblazer, a man who wore perfume in a world of gunpowder, who curated pleasure amid the machinery of power, and who never apologized for not wanting the throne everyone assumed he should chase. And if Ludwig Victor's flamboyance led to exile, King Charles I of Württemberg's gentler defiance came dressed in diplomacy, a ruler who found companionship not in generals or noble women, but in a handsome American chamberlain whose name was whispered across Europe with the kind of curiosity reserved for stories no one could officially confirm. 22. King Charles I of Württemberg. King Charles I of Württemberg wore his crown like a well-fitted glove, carefully, quietly, and with an old-world discretion that made his reign seem more like a slow, elegant waltz than a thunderous march of policy. He was no revolutionary, no conqueror. He did not reinvent his kingdom or reshape Europe. Instead, Charles ruled for nearly 5 decades, from 1864 to 1891, with the kind of subdued constitutional monarchy that modern historians often describe as stable, ceremonial, or more tellingly, uneventful. But what slipped between the lines of those polite biographies was something less quiet, less ceremonial, and far more whispered, the matter of Charles's personal life, and the man who entered it stood beside it and nearly unraveled the fragile diplomatic fabric of his carefully curated reign. Charles was born in 1823 into a world that expected royalty to be models of marital propriety. By the time he came of age, the dynastic map of Europe was already in motion, shifting alliances, arranged marriages, and delicate balances of bloodlines that functioned more like business contracts than romantic endeavors. He played his part. He married Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna of Russia in 1846, the daughter of Tsar Nicholas I, and a woman who brought both Russian prestige and an unspoken list of imperial obligations. But the marriage was, from the start, one of polite distance. There were no children, no great romantic declarations. Olga was intelligent, dutiful, and genuinely respected her husband, but even their closest contemporaries acknowledged that theirs was a marriage of political symmetry, not emotional entanglement. The Queen busied herself with charitable works and cultural patronage. Charles, meanwhile, busied himself elsewhere. Enter Charles Woodcock, a young, dashing American of modest background who somehow, almost inexplicably, found himself in the royal orbit. Originally serving as a royal chamberlain, a role traditionally filled by nobility and marked by trust, Woodcock quickly became far more than a court official. He became a constant companion to the king, a fixture, a fascination. Württemberg, known for its social conservatism, didn't quite know what to do with Woodcock. He was neither aristocrat nor diplomat. He had no claim to royal heritage or political utility, and yet Charles treated him with astonishing favour. He was granted titles and honours far above his station, most notably being elevated to the rank of Freiherr, Baron, an act that sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. Whispers turned to outrage. The court fumed, ministers raised objections, foreign dignitaries took note. The king was accused of imprudence, a euphemism that barely concealed the undertones of what everyone was really saying. That Woodcock's presence in the palace was not just inappropriate, but possibly intimate. The backlash became impossible to ignore. Public sentiment turned. Newspapers abroad, less burdened by local deference, began speculating openly about the nature of the relationship. Facing mounting pressure, Woodcock resigned his position and left Württemberg in 1888. The scandal, though never officially addressed, remained an open wound in Charles's otherwise understated reign. The king never commented on the matter. He didn't need to. His behaviour spoke volumes. After Woodcock's departure, Charles's health declined. He became increasingly withdrawn, relying on his routines, his household staff, and his queen, who, to her credit, never publicly criticised her husband's choices. Whether she knew the full truth or simply accepted the distance between them is a question history can't answer, but the palace never truly recovered from the ripples of what became one of the most peculiar royal scandals of the 19th century. Charles died in 1891, childless and quietly mourned. His funeral was stately, proper, and predictably restrained. No trace of Charles Woodcock appeared in the official proceedings. The memory of their relationship, if it was indeed a relationship, was quietly brushed away, preserved only in letters, anecdotes, and the rare biographical footnote that dares to wonder aloud what really happened in the salons of Stuttgart. Today, Charles I of Württemberg remains a study in contrasts, a constitutional monarch who avoided controversy, except for the one he couldn't. A husband in name, a king by law, and perhaps a man who fell in love with someone the world told him he couldn't love. And while Charles tried to elevate affection through nobility, Prince Hubertus of Prussia would face something colder, a world at war, a family aligned with tyranny, and a truth about himself that was at odds with everything his uniform stood for. 23. Prince Hubertus of Prussia. Prince Hubertus of Prussia was born into a family that demanded obedience, celebrated militarism, and carved its legacy with medals, uniforms, and the disciplined weight of silence. He was the grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the last German emperor, and part of the House of Hohenzollern, a dynasty that had ruled Prussia and then Germany with a mixture of steel and spectacle for centuries. Hubertus, by birth, was destined to uphold the family brand, a man of duty, a symbol of order, a soldier in the long line of imperial continuity. But Prince Hubertus was never a perfect fit for the mould. He was born in 1909 into a crumbling empire. The German monarchy was on the verge of collapse. The war was going badly, revolution was in the air, and by the time he turned 10, the Kaiser was in exile and the Weimar Republic had risen in the ruins. Hubertus's childhood was defined not by grandeur, but by displacement. The Hohenzollerns were no longer sovereigns, they were symbols, often resented, frequently watched, and forced to play their roles with increasingly careful restraint. While his brothers embraced the family's legacy of military conformity and authoritarian leanings, Hubertus seemed drawn elsewhere. He was the quiet son, the artistic one. He preferred literature and the mountains to drills and ceremonies. Where his siblings sought rank and recognition in Germany's resurgent army, Hubertus kept his ambitions closer to the chest. His temperament was described by contemporaries as refined, sensitive, and, though few said it outright, subtly at odds with the austere Hohenzollern image. As he entered adulthood, the atmosphere around him darkened. The 1930s in Germany were not just politically volatile, they were ideologically claustrophobic. As the Nazi Party rose to power, it demanded rigid conformity in thought, in loyalty, and most ominously, in personal identity. Many German aristocrats either aligned themselves with the regime or kept quiet out of fear and self-preservation. Several members of the extended Hohenzollern family expressed public support for the Nazis, hoping to regain influence or position under Hitler's nationalist banner. Hubertus did not. He kept his distance, politically, socially, and, according to some sources, even emotionally. He joined the military, as expected, but remained an outlier in the family. Behind closed doors, rumors circulated about why. Within the royal households and expatriate salons of the 1930s, people whispered about Hubertus's private life. His close friendships with male companions were noted. His disinterest in marriage was speculated upon. His reluctance to appear too public or too political was interpreted as discretion, not just strategic, but personal. Among the more persistent accounts were those linking him with fellow officers, friends from youth, and artistic circles where coded language often served as protection. While no confirmed romantic partners ever emerged, the language surrounding Hubertus remained the same. He was different, and different in Nazi Germany was dangerous. Though he wore the uniform of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, there is evidence that he did so without conviction. Some of his relatives later remarked that Hubertus struggled with the ideological direction of the country. He was not a dissenter in the public sense. That would have been fatal, but those who knew him suggested a growing internal conflict. How could he serve a regime that stood against everything he quietly was? His life ended not with scandal, but with tragedy. In 1950, while on a humanitarian mission in Africa, he contracted appendicitis. The region lacked the facilities for proper medical treatment, and he died of complications at the age of 41. His death was mourned within his family, but never deeply examined by historians. Perhaps because it was easier to let him fade, the quiet son, the respectable but unremarkable prince, than to unpack what made him so different. Yet Prince Hubertus remains one of the few royals of his era whose life hints at a quiet resistance, not through rebellion, but through integrity. He didn't shout, but he didn't conform either. He refused the easy alignment his family made with fascism, declined to play the part expected of him in a country that demanded uniformity, and left behind a legacy built not on power, but on quiet courage. And while Hubertus bore his difference in silence, King Henry II of France would cloak his contradictions in courtly splendour, balancing a powerful queen, a famous mistress, and an inner circle of male courtiers who received his deepest affections and raised centuries of speculation with every glance. 24. King Henry II of France. King Henry II of France is often remembered as the man between two women, caught between the icy brilliance of his wife, Catherine de' Medici, and the enchanting grip of his famous mistress, Diane de Poitiers. The three formed one of Europe's most talked about royal triangles, their portraits hanging side by side in castles where the ceilings whispered gossip. But what history often ignores is that Henry's emotional life may have had another axis entirely. Not a woman, but a series of men whose presence at his court and his side unsettled observers and left behind the faint, persistent perfume of something deliberately unspoken. Henry was born in 1519, the second son of Francis I, a flamboyant king who embraced Renaissance grandeur with operatic flair. As a child, Henry was sent as a hostage to the Spanish court, collateral, in the bitter chess match between France and the Habsburg Empire. It left a mark. He returned to France older than his years, reserved, formal, and harder to read than his father had ever been. Unlike Francis, who adored the spotlight and moved through court like a lion through roses, Henry preferred shadow. He was a man of fixed routines, soft words, and complicated silences. He married Catherine de' Medici at the age of 14. Politically brilliant, emotionally frosty, and unfathomably patient, Catherine played the long game. Their marriage was productive, 10 children, but the romance was another matter. From the beginning, Henry's attentions seemed to orbit elsewhere. Most famously around Diane de Poitiers, his senior by 20 years, who became his official mistress and cultural co-sovereign. But behind the splendor of that arrangement, there was another pattern, one less polished, more carefully tucked away behind the velvet curtains of the court. Henry kept an unusually close circle of young male favorites, noblemen who rose rapidly through the ranks, often with little explanation beyond their charm, their proximity to the king, and their apparent knack for keeping him at ease. Chief among them was Anne de Montmorency, a name that confuses modern readers, but not the court of 16th century France. Anne, then a common male name among French aristocracy, was no mere servant or military man. He was Henry's constant companion, his confidant, and his most enduring political ally. Montmorency's rise was meteoric. He was named Grand Master of France, Constable of the realm, and eventually wielded power equal to the king himself. But it was his emotional closeness to Henry that sparked curiosity. Contemporary accounts describe the two as inseparable, not in the occasional or ceremonial sense, but in the everyday, private, domestic sense. They dined together, rode together, disappeared from court for long periods. Henry even referred to Montmorency in letters with language far more tender than royal correspondence typically allowed. He wasn't alone. Other young men, page boys, squires, minor nobles, seemed to enjoy disproportionate access to the king's personal chambers. Their presence was explained away as military training, household service, or courtly education. But the courtiers whispered, and the clergy, always eager to police propriety, began to voice discomfort with the culture developing around the king. Catherine, for her part, said nothing. She was a strategist, not a romantic, and understood the value of silence. Diane de Poitiers, more perceptive than most, seems to have tolerated the entire constellation of Henry's attachments as long as her own position remained secure. Whether she resented or understood his emotional inclinations, no record survives to say. But she was no fool. She knew that kings fall in love, and not always with their wives or mistresses. Henry's reign was defined by war, religious division, and the uneasy balancing act of France's Catholic and Protestant factions. But his personal life was a quieter battlefield, one where his affections didn't align with the image of the warrior king. His softness, his need for loyalty, and his habit of surrounding himself with young men whom he elevated and adored all stood in contrast to the brutal politics of his time. He died in 1559 after a tournament accident, a lance through the eye, poetic and horrifying. He left behind a wife who would become the Iron Mother of French politics, a mistress who would be exiled from court, and a trail of courtiers whose careers ended the moment his breath did. Montmorency survived him for a while before falling from grace under the shifting loyalties of the Valois dynasty. Today, Henry is remembered mostly for the women in his life, but look closer, and another story emerges, a quieter thread, not recorded in treaties or laws, but in glances, letters, promotions, and the strange persistence of certain names beside his in the margins of French history. And while Henry II's story ends behind a gilded visor, Prince Louis II of Monaco's legacy unspools more slowly, not in jousts or royal declarations, but in the smoky clubs of Paris, in discreet conversations behind closed palace doors, and in the company he kept when no one was supposed to be watching. 25. Prince Louis II of Monaco. Prince Louis II of Monaco was the last monarch of the Old World and the first prince of the modern problem, how to rule a kingdom that was essentially the size of a golf course, but somehow still expected to embody royal grandeur. Born in 1870, Louis II inherited a principality that was glamorous only on postcards, and a title that sounded far more powerful than it actually was. But what he lacked in geopolitical clout, he made up for in mystique, the kind that followed him through wars, foreign affairs, and most curiously, a private life that Monaco never officially acknowledged but always quietly noticed. Before he was prince, Louis was a soldier. He fought in the French army, not the Monegasque one, which didn't really exist, and served with distinction in World War I. There, amid the carnage of the trenches, he cultivated a reputation for loyalty, intellect, and quiet charm. But while his military record was respectable, it wasn't what fascinated people. What fascinated people was what he did when he wasn't marching. Louis spent most of his early adulthood in Paris, where he occupied a social world that wasn't exactly underground, but definitely wasn't aristocracy approved. The Paris of the Belle Époque was many things, decadent, elegant, theatrical, but above all, it was discreet, and Louis thrived in its shadows. He developed friendships with artists, actors, designers, and certain members of the French diplomatic class whose uniforms sparkled just a little more brightly when they entered the room with him. He was known to frequent the salons and private clubs of Montmartre and Montparnasse, not the ones where ambassadors toasted treaties, but the ones where reputations were both made and quietly destroyed. According to gossip that hovered like perfume, Prince Louis kept company with a small rotating circle of young men, dancers, poets, and courtiers whose official titles were vague, but whose presence was consistent. None of this, of course, made it into the newspapers. Monaco had no appetite for scandal, and Louis, ever the tactician, knew exactly how to play the long game. He never married, at least not in the traditional sense. He did, however, father a daughter with a French cabaret singer. The affair was brief, the child illegitimate, and the situation handled with the kind of hush money and legal reconfigurations only royalty can afford. The daughter, Charlotte, was later legitimized and named heir, problem solved, dynasty preserved. But the bachelor prince remained an enigma. During his reign, Louis turned Monaco from a sleepy seaside resort into a geopolitical curiosity, a tax haven, a playground for the ultra-wealthy, and eventually a cultural magnet. He established the Oceanographic Institute, collected Napoleonic artifacts, and surrounded himself with scholars and historians. His intellectual life was public, his emotional life was not. Foreign diplomats remarked that he was eccentric and reclusive. Court staff noted the long private dinners, the walks along the cliffs, the unannounced visits from male friends who never seemed to stay in Monaco long enough to require formal introductions. There were no scandals, there were no confessions, there were only patterns and a carefully maintained silence. Prince Louis abdicated in 1949, passing the throne to his grandson Rainier III. He retired to a quieter life, rarely seen in public, and died in 1949, leaving behind a Monaco poised to enter the world stage through a different kind of spectacle, Hollywood royalty. But long before Grace Kelly, before casinos and yachts and paparazzi, there was Louis, the quiet prince of secrets, who ruled not with flash but with discretion. And if Louis II ended his story in silence, then James I had started ours with sonnets. Between them stretches a line of royal men who reigned while hiding, ruled while loving, and lived while being watched, a lineage not of scandal but of complexity, a lineage the history books never quite knew how to write.